To start by talking a little bit about what I'm hoping to get out of today's hour together. And that is to really talk about facts. You know, I've been on these Zoom calls for, I think it's been 2 months. Some of the gals who are on here, I know Lindsay's been on here, Mickey Sonia's been on our Zoom calls at 10 a.m. But something that I always leave with by the 11:30 hour, it's like, gosh, there's more unknown than not. All these calls that I've been on, I just feel like there's more unknowns than answers, and that's what we've been living with. So I wanted to do something a little different and talk about facts and talk about what do we know? How are we going to open? What are the steps needed? Are you guys even ready? Everyone's antsy pants to get open. I get it. But have we been working on specific things that are going to be required of us? And do we know what those things are? So I thought it'd be a great panel with you ladies because you've touched so many different areas of events. You know, Gabby Seasons hasn't closed at all since this started, and you've been doing your due diligence and staying informed and pivoting and really looking at, you know, what is next for you and really having your ear to the ground. Nicole, same thing with rentals, you guys and Bright, and you know, having national capacity there. Leanne starting, you know, here locally and looking at a venue and the venue aspect of stuff that you need to bring a caterer into, and of course KVB with having the international touch of what are corporations doing, what can you bring to the table, what nuggets of knowledge do you have that you can share with us today. So I put together, you guys, this checklist, and I got this. So I want to stick to facts. You know, these conversations come into like, what's going to happen when we do this, and how are we going to do that, and how's a ballroom going to look, and when can we do 50 people, or is it going to jump to 250? We don't know any of that. So I got facts. I got things from CDC. I got things from California Resilience Roadmap specific to California. I know that Santa Barbara is working on doing some things themselves, but I thought this would be a great place to start specifically with facts, right? So with this checklist, there's 7 must-dos, and then we'll take a deeper dive into the last 5 because the top 2 are really something that really you need to be thinking about right now. And have you ladies, the panel, have you identified someone? So number 1, identify who are the people responsible for implementing your plan. Do you have someone on board? How have you done that? How do you choose someone? What are your thoughts?
So I can speak to this one. So actually, Nicole and I collaborated on what I am currently using at Seasons, and we talked pretty shortly after March 12th about what this looks like, how am I going to keep my team safe. And so I actually implemented immediately a in-house system on just everything from opening up the front doors to receiving mail to receiving orders, how we operate in the kitchen, what we do at the end of the day, who's in charge of that, how we monitor our team. We have been fortunate enough to stay open throughout this whole time. We did have layoffs, though we were able to maintain a team of 7, and 4 of us actually only coming into the office and 3 offsite working. Because our team was so small, we made an internal pact with kind of our Seasons family pact that ourselves and our families were going to social distance. So there wasn't too much variable there. It was a pretty cut and dry, we're all isolating, and we have essentially stuck to that throughout this entire time, which has been challenging with a boatload of kids that are involved in this whole thing as well that have to really adhere to that, and spouses. So our situation's unique in that most of the spouses actually were laid off, so they were already at home, and so they could self-isolate as opposed to going into an office space. So the first thing for us was that we had confidence that we were going to be able to pull that off and still maintain a safe work environment for the team. As we've introduced people, we have just continued to educate everyone on our process of how they take their temperature when they come in, and how they monitor, sanitation throughout the whole process. Anybody who's ever worked with me knows I'm kind of OCD on cleanliness anyway. So implementing this system was like, ooh, I can get on board with this really quickly. So that's how we've been operating. And I do think our situation has been fortunate and unique, unlike some of the other businesses that can't control their team as much as that were able to do so and are continuing to do so.
Great. And do you have one person? So is it you? Are you the one in charge? You are. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Same for us. We have, the person who is in charge is our general manager, and he works with a partnership team and a management team to design and implement all of our policies with regards to health screening and health regulations. And like Gabby said, we're a little bit more of a broad team, so I don't think that we have I won't call it a luxury, but the ability to stay within a bubble that is expanded. But we're working with a limited staff in office. Everybody's in different spaces at this point. I think we are going to begin to roll into bringing a few more personnel into the office. So I think that we'll have a good opportunity to initiate a lot of these plans that are just, people wearing face masks in the office, eliminating coffee rooms. We have to restructure our break room. Our break room was definitely not something that promoted social distancing in the past. So we've had to sort of think through how do we bring back larger numbers of our team members to work a little bit more regularly than what we have been operating with. But like Gabby, we've been in operation even since the shutdown, mostly doing emergency response at the beginning. And so we've had an opportunity to really address and deal with the sanitization of equipment and stuff like that.
Gotcha. Great. Leanne?
Yeah, we have a really tight-knit team. We're owner-operated, and the owners live here in the Valley. And so we're a relatively large operation comparatively. And we have a really tight team working kind of in zones where I'm doing a lot of the research on what are event-specific guidelines we need to be aware of, whereas Callie might be working on some of the legal aspects. And so we're formulating in our own expertise, so to speak, and then we're coming together to discuss and formulate how we're going to do things. We have 3 tasting rooms and 2 venues, so we have a lot of things to sort out. And one of our venues, we have in-house catering. So we have multiple layers of things to work through. I have lots and lots of notes, and I've just started formulating some more specific protocol that I think we're going to do at events. As you mentioned, we're in a wait and see at this point, but we are anticipating things like guest count restrictions and social distancing at events and in our tasting rooms. And we're already proactively coming up with how are we going to change how we do food service, how we interact with the guests while they're on property. So I think it's going to be something that develops over many, many months, but we're definitely starting to formulate the things we know for sure that are going to be in place.
Great. Kirsten?
So as a company, Four Seasons has implemented it. It's called Lead with Care, and it's basically operating guidelines for every aspect of the hotel, from rooms, engineering, all of the restaurants. It's pretty detailed, so we're fortunate enough to have those guidelines to kind of work with. We got directive from Johns Hopkins on sort of how and what type of procedures that we needed to implement in order to reopen the property. As I've mentioned on other calls, there's a lot that comes to from every aspect, so it's a bit overwhelming, frankly. In terms of staffing, I think I mentioned earlier that we're anticipating opening on June the 1st. What that means in terms of staffing, I think it's going to be a soft opening. We're fortunate enough at the property to have the bungalows, so we can kind of, have people in bungalows and not utilize the main hotel, and, different things like that we as a property are fortunate enough being on a large landmass. So that's happening. As it relates to events, we're again sort of falling into the entire food and beverage directive, which is, focusing on all the operations, the bar operations. There's just, again, so much as it relates to the restaurants, and then falls back into events. We are currently, I don't know if I'm kind of jumping ahead here, but some of the things that we're working on is we've got a diagramming system called Social Tables that you guys are probably all familiar with, and we're working on diagramming out the ballrooms because, as you know, with the social distancing, that's really prohibiting us from doing large events in the ballrooms. Obviously, there's all those things that we are also doing that are, like, again, company directive, like we're not doing buffets, that's gone away. Changing the procedures with condiments, suspending bread service, not presetting tables, no menus, all of that type of stuff. Serving with gloves and masks, that's going to be obviously the way of the future. Travel size hand sanitizers at every table. That's another thing I think we're all going to get used to. Some other things that we've been talking about, are staffing reduction and scheduling, obviously, to bring in, as we open up the hotel, we'll be bringing in less staff, I think, and we will be trying to utilize the team that we have a little more efficiently. Reducing the number of suppliers, so the amount of traffic that comes on to the back loading dock, again, kind of minimizing what that looks like, as not to be exposed. Menu adjustments, we're one of the projects that I'll be looking at next week is kind of what the menu offerings will be, and trying to streamline that a little bit so that, one, we're it's becoming more efficient. We can use suppliers that are able to, kind of consolidating suppliers a little bit, so it all sort of ties in. And then, as I mentioned, the buffets. Let's see. Yeah, operational consolidations. Yeah.
And do you have so as well, let's move on from that. So so details of the plan. This is number 2. The details of your emergency plan should be based on the size and duration of your events, demographics of the participants, complexity of your event operations, and the type of on-site services and activities you may want to offer. And this came directly from over 250 mass gatherings is where I got it from. So that's something also to keep in mind based on, as we know, where is it, how many people, where are people coming from, how many moving parts do you have, which events usually have quite a bit. So again, for everyone who's on here, those are things that you need to be thinking about right now for those guidelines, like you guys have just spelled out for us. So then if we move on to these 5 right here, we'll go into detail a little bit. And the first one is work site, a specific plan, and to create a COVID-19 prevention plan at every facility, and designate a person at each facility to implement the plan. So what we're talking about is not just creating the plan, but who's going to be on site. And I think this is one of the conversations we've had, is who's responsible? Is it the planner at the events? Is it the catering manager? We don't know that right now. Do you guys have any plans in place for your own entities as far as that goes?
Well, I think it's going to have to be a collaboration. I don't think anybody can say they're not intimately involved with all of this coming together and working. So that means the event host, the planner, the venue, the catering staff, everybody has to be on the same page. And so as from a venue perspective, we're establishing what are non-negotiables for us, what safety plan we have to have in place so that our guests and our staff are safe and complying. And then from there, we will work out how that plays out logistically with what's actually planned for the wedding and what adjustments need to be made. Is it moving from a self-serve hors d'oeuvre station to past sample plates of hors d'oeuvres? Is it moving away from that pre-ceremony self-serve beverage and moving into actually passing those things? Like how are we adjusting what's already on the plan to fit into the safety protocol that we're going to establish? But I don't know, I think we can all agree nobody's going to be able to just say that's somebody else's job anymore.
I think it will fall back on the venue the more I think about it. I mean, even if it is just a park or a city lot, they're going to have a rep there. I mean, any venue that's hosting, even in a state, is probably going to be held accountable for that. And so there's probably going to have to be a lot more involvement from them.
Well, I think that, so we've had a lot of discussion about this just from our sort of production and our operational standpoint of things, given that we have teams, we're typically first on, last off, and just trying to develop a strategy and use some of the existing tools that we have, like our routing systems on how to track who are the team members that are going to each job. We'll have 4 team members, for example, a delivery crew who will touch 10 job sites in a day, maybe more in the busy season. And so how we can take those lists out of our routing system and be able to get them in an easy format that we can forward to the planner and or the venue. I do think Paige is right. I think that it's really going to end up coming down to the planner and the venue, because those are kind of the two stationary elements of an event that, you have a venue that everybody's going to, and at some level that venue is going to need to know who all those people are so that they can trace them should anything come up.
Right.
And then the planner, because the planner is the person who's really keeping track of all of the vendors, sub-vendors. We bring in sub-vendors all the time. So understanding who all of my sub-vendors are, who their teams are, and really keeping solid logs of that. So making sure that we have we have our own tools in place to sort of be able to implement that. That's part of our continual operating guidelines. And I think that as planners and venues move forward with this notion of how am I going to plan and how am I going to open, understanding every single person that touches a job site before and after, from start to finish, it has to be a part of their reopening plans.
Yeah, I think wedding planners will be more important than ever, and they might even have to be required at even the simplest events, venues, and weddings.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, like Kirsten mentioned, and she sort of alluded to this notion of reducing the number of vendors that they're using for food services and for deliveries and things like that. I think too, and I know that having been doing this for 21 years, I've seen social events, nonprofit events, wedding events transition from a core group of 5 vendors to a core group of 50 vendors.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the timelines I read have 7 different rental companies included on them.
Mm-hmm.
And so, ultimately it will be the choice of the designer and the planner, but the more vendors you have on a project, the more people you're going to have to track and trace. And so I think too, down the road, you'll begin to see people narrow the scope of the number of vendors they're using. We're doing it on our end too, in a similar fashion, of who we have coming in and dropping off goods, who we're ordering goods from, who our suppliers are. I think that anybody who's doing a lot of that.
And probably keeping it more professional and a lot less fly-by-night, DIY, under the radar type of people. I mean, even in this day and age, we were still getting pushback on why does my vendor need to have insurance? Why does my wedding planner need to have insurance? I mean, those were conversations we were having earlier this year. And that, I assume, will completely change. Like that type of a benchmark will be non-negotiable, and it won't just be insurance. It'll probably be a whole other slew of factors as well.
Well, and I think one of the things that I don't think the format is going to change too much, in the sense of what Leanne was saying, is her venue is going to have its, base. These are our non-negotiable points that everybody coming on property has to adhere to. And then those vendors, like Seasons Catering, has to have their own internal plan that's going to be able to meet those qualifications. And so I think it's quite similar to what the process that we all currently follow. We just, like having insurance and liquor, whatever we have in terms of coverage, it's just going to now include a very extensive COVID plan as well.
Right. And I think that probably this is, I'm sure, within everybody's plan, particularly those of us who are operating with large groups of people or bringing people in that are transitionary workers. The plan starts with making sure that all of our team members who are working are healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's absolutely the first step. And I think if you can maintain that, and that includes daily logs, recording. I mean, we do temperature checks. It gets recorded. It's not just something that you check and you say, okay, great, you're done. It's recorded every day so that you can see any variation of it. Doing temperature checks on the way out. It's, some things develop throughout the day. And face masks, gloves. So making sure that we have all the proper PPE and that we have, and that we're making sure that our teams are healthy to start with. That's kind of the baseline. And then from there, at some level, if you can ensure that, and if you're tracking that, then what goes out into the field, interacts with other people, is safe.
Mm-hmm.
Kirsten, is that something as far as employees and a soft opening in June, or I don't know I know you're working from home, but if you're going in, are you guys temperature checking, or are any of you? I think Gabby, you are, right? Nicole, are you?
We do temperature check, and we have a weekly sign-in sheet that actually lists a whole questions that each employee needs to answer, then sign off for the week. So yeah, we do.
And we'll be doing temperature checks as well.
Right. So like when you walk into security, check.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Nicole brought us kind of to the second point. I'm going to skim through some of these things because we could be here forever, as you guys know, but it is the training and communication. So that is the second point, training with and communication with employees and employee representatives on the plan, including, as we seeking medical attention, the importance of hand washing. So do you have a plan in place for your employees? I mean, that's really what number 2 is everyone should have a training manual at this point, a COVID training manual for employees that they sign and adhere to.
We do have a document, but I mean, the document is like 80 pages, but we have posted signs is really what we have. So you'll see when you come to our front doors one day, when y'all come back to our front doors, we have like 3 signs posted at our front door. They're posted all throughout the warehouse. They're posted in the office. So it's not just a document that somebody might take and file away. It's something that's in their face ongoing regularly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're doing the same. Again, Nicole and I kind of collaborated a lot on how Seasons created theirs. And we have posters up everywhere. And then we do have a simple 1 through 10, this is how you receive an order from another vendor and how you process that order and, where it sits and when you can touch it and the whole thing. And it's once you walk into the offices, what does that look like? And when you get mail, where does that mail go? I mean, we've got it down to we just kind of broke down all of the operations and compartmentalized them and then gave them each a process to go through that every employee can go through. So.
And we were in the process of doing, I was actively putting together and working on a new training manual. And we had already started training kind of anew our staff for events and bringing in some really seasoned staff for events as well for this season and next season. So I was already in deep with the training manual and developing these protocols for the winery and the farm. So now we'll just expand that to include the new COVID guidelines. We're definitely we're hoping that the tasting rooms on some level can reopen in June. And we have events on the books in August. So we plan to be fully trained, fully documented, and all of those things in place, and everybody understanding what's expected from an internal standpoint when the events do kick up. But we're going to need to do that sooner for tasting room anyway. We will have all of that outlined and everybody on the same page and having received that training.
And I would presume that perhaps on some level, all of those plans will have to be provided to certain vendors or to the clients or to the venue, again, just proving that they're working and hiring vendors who are following directions.
Yeah, in fact, in the Santa Barbara Rise guide, and if anybody has happened to read that, the 80 pages of the document, there is a 3-page or a 2-page attestation form, a self-attestation form that you're supposed to complete and have posted. And I think that that's something that probably this industry could use or utilize to have all the vendors attest to their practices and their safety precautions, and include that as a sort of informational packet that they provide to the planner who has to provide it to the venues. So like an insurance certificate that we have to provide to all of our venues, we'll also have to provide the self-attestation form.
Great. And what about, so then the next, after employee training, and again, you guys look this through with a fine-tooth comb, we'll skip over some of the stuff, but obviously you're encouraging your training. What happens, Gabby, any of you guys, what happens when 3-4 team members, a quarter of your team, or whatever the case might be, shows up with a fever? Short staffing?
So I definitely think we're going to need to have a kind of we were just talking about that last week, like backup, like team B that can come in on call essentially. I do have to say, just from experience, this is kind of one of those, oh my God, what do we do now? Well, okay, so we have a system in place and we have someone who can come in and cover that. But then you're thinking, okay, well, in the back of your brain, you're thinking, who has that person been exposed to already on the team? And what does that mean? And, that feeds into, a lot of unknowns and opening up a much larger picture. So I think to compartmentalize that question, it's really just a matter of you have a procedure where we have an on-site or on-call team that is ready to step in. And as we all know, there's another cost. I mean, that's now you're incurring additional costs that hopefully you're going to be able to pass on to your client in a way that you can justify that. But I think it speaks largely to how many additional costs that we are going to be having to pass on to the client and how expensive it's going to get. So it's interesting.
On our end, Zoe, and I think just to sort of speak to the actual incident. So Gabby, I don't know where you guys are doing your temperature checks, but ours take place on the exterior of our facility. So that's step one. They are private. If there is a line of people not that we have a line of people right now, but we anticipate down the road, we might have a line of people for temperature check-ins who will be socially distant, standing under umbrellas in the sun. There's a separate room. So it's like a 2-lane temperature check facility that if you're clear, you go through one lane. If for any reason you represent with a fever, you go to a different holding area. So nobody can see in that holding area. So nobody knows until, of course, you get in the office. Now, our office team is kind of small, so you're going to know pretty quickly if you saw somebody in line and then you get into the office and you don't see them in the office. They're checked a second time, and if they still represent with the fever, then they're sent home. And then they're sent home and they're directed to number one, they can't come back to work while they have a fever, and then they're directed to follow the CDC COVID-19 guidelines. If you think you have a fever, you have to go get tested, and and then you can't come back until you're fever-free for the number of days. I think it's 3 days post-fever. You have to have a doctor's note.
Yeah. Wait, can I ask a question though? My understanding per CDC right now is you actually, as an employer, cannot mandate an employee to have the test. And there's a procedure that you follow if that particular employee declines taking the test.
Well, we're not mandating that they take a test, but we are requiring them to, they can't come to work if they have a fever, and then they can't return to work without a doctor's note.
Yeah. You have to actually, I think it goes into more depth upon that, that you have to actually be X amount of days without any, from the time you first showed symptoms, whether if it was you showed symptoms on Monday, you'd have to wait 2 weeks to from that particular date in order to be released if you have not had a COVID test. Now, if you've done a COVID test and you just have to show 2 negative tests within outside of a 24-hour period in order to be able to come back. And that, again, like as Nicole was saying, has to be done in conjunction with your doctor.
I see some questions. Somebody asked who's taking temperatures. So currently it's our general manager, but I suspect that as we ramp up and we have, at least for us, as we have more people coming to the facility, we'll have a designated person who takes temperatures.
And taking it back to the event side of things, that's who's going to do that at the event. Is it the planner? Is it the venue? Is it the catering? You know, like, does each entity do it themselves? So these are food. We don't have that answer right now, but that's going to be the norm.
Our policy is actually going to be our internal team's going to manage our own temperatures. Currently is what we have. That way that we have full control over it, because it is a liability on each individual business entity at some level. So you probably want to have as much control over that as possible.
Yeah, and then I see Diane sort of noted something in the group chat. I mean, for us, we have all kinds of records on our employees that are private and personal, Social Security information, drug testing information. The logs that we create is just another piece of information that is absolutely confidential. It's not shared with anybody. And it's stored in the same fashion that we store all of the other employee records in a very safe and confidential manner.
Anything else before we move on to the next one, Paige, Leanne?
I was just going to say, we're going to over-prepare and be overly cautious, I think, initially, until we kind of get a read on how all this is going to play out. And for event-specific things, you know, each client is going to be, and each host of the event is going to have different sensitivities to things. So like I said before, we're going to have the things that we just implement no matter what, and then from there try and work around what makes them comfortable and what makes them uncomfortable about executing that event. I think fortunately for us, we're starting a little bit later in the season, and we also are starting with some smaller guest counts. I think part of it is going to be attrition with travel, and part of it is, you know, people not wanting to travel and come to an event with 50 or 60 other people. And part of it is going to be in that we just happen to have on the calendar smaller events. So I think that all of these questions in terms of who's taking temps and, you know, will there be something required from the host? Will there be something required from the guests? All of that is TBD. But I think initially we're going to err on the side of overly cautious so that we not only cover ourselves, but cover the people coming to our venue.
For Leanne and Kirsten, I'm curious if either of you as venue or Paige, as people who are associated with the venue, are you planning on including in your requirements temperature testing of guests at an event?
That's under research right now, because we don't legally we can do that. So that's really going to be determined. And gosh, right? There's so many questions around that. How do you gotten to that? Yeah, right now, no, we don't have any policy on that.
Right, and ditto to Leanne. It's no at this point.
Yeah, I'm guessing that would be immensely challenging on a very large level, especially at a hotel where it's somewhat open to the public. You've got people coming and going for food and beverage who are obviously staying at the hotel, who are not staying at the hotel, who are temporarily there. You know, there's certainly going to be a lot more checks, I assume, but I don't foresee that really working out. Now, I could see a host possibly, you know, or if a business is hosting a meeting, or if a bride and groom are, you know, very serious about temperature checking their guests, I suppose that could be a conversation that might end up happening, but I can't see us implementing that. And I don't know, because I'm on furlough right now, but I just feel like that's not something that we would get into.
I think the question is voluntary precautions as a venue and mandated procedures and guidelines, and that's what we're waiting on. Is what are the state and the county going to say is required is temperature testing of guests going to be required and part of a new maybe law? That's the big question. I don't think as a venue we would voluntarily test guests. I think that's pretty invasive and
I mean, I assume because the Hilton is currently open, so they do have people staying overnight, and I don't believe that those folks are getting temperature tested now.
I've been to your property and they didn't temperature check me when I went.
There you go. So,
Anything else before we move on to the next kind of phase of this? Again, skimming things over, but these are great things to take home and think about and start creating these training manuals, right? Mm-hmm. What about, okay, so let's talk a little bit, since we're on this subject, face covers for your staff, disposable gloves, additional hand washing stations. Gabby, I was talking to you about decades ago, the whole sink hand washing station stuff. I don't know, you guys take it from there. What about mandating for your staff to do that?
Well, we do currently. So everyone has to wear a mask. I wear it throughout the entire office, except for when I'm in my specific space by myself. But as soon as someone comes into my office or I walk outside of my office, I put my mask on. Again, we're the same people, like the same little team of people. So, but again, it comes back to lead by example. So, wearing a mask for 12 hours a day isn't really the funnest thing, but it's just kind of what is the new norm now. And so our whole team does, as well as, we go through gloves like no tomorrow. So it's crazy. So we've always been really into wearing those gloves and changing them out. So, and now where I'm constantly reminding people, make sure you've washed your hands for 30 seconds. It's 20 seconds. You tell them 30, hoping to get the 20 out of it. So, it's just a song to sing. Just constant reminders. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's not too out of my norm anyway. It's just annoying more now because I say it a lot more often.
I think also with, when you're working with your own team, it's going to be really important to get the team on board. It's going to be really important to make the team join the cause and to take it as seriously as anyone else, and to make them understand that this is their business, their livelihood, and other people's lives that are at stake. So not to take it flippantly, not to cut corners. And that's a whole nother can of worms when you have to send an employee home for 2 weeks. But I think that's going to help a lot, is having a team in place that really supports all of those different standards.
Yeah. For us, wearing masks and gloves is not the norm. I think because Gabby's food service, it is a little bit, at least for half of our team, certainly. It's new, I'm sure, for the front office staff. But so on our end, we are, like Gabby said, mandating masks anytime we're in general office settings. And if anybody's come to our office and seen our office, there are sections of our office that are what I'd call like quads, where you have a lot of people sitting together in an open space. So we're reconfiguring some of that. Nobody's facing one another. Everybody's facing a wall. Those people will be required to wear masks when they're working in general spaces. All of our operational teams will be wearing masks when they can't social distance, which is for the most part all day while they're working in the warehouse. When they're out on deliveries, when they're in the truck sitting next to one another, they'll be wearing masks. They'll be wearing gloves. For all deliveries, they'll be changing gloves in between each delivery. They'll be wearing gloves while they're loading and touching equipment that isn't already protected. A lot of our equipment moves protected. Dish, glass, silver, it all moves in plastic bags. And our dish teams are already wearing gloves while they're packing them. They'll also be wearing masks now. So for us, it's been a little bit of a new and added thing. We haven't had to do a lot of it yet, but that's what's part of our protocol that we'll be implementing when we do get a little bit more up to full speed.
Kirsten, any news on that front with other properties that have opened as far as the gloves, the masks, the guests requirements?
Is same scenario in terms of, the masks and the gloves will be required. However, in our office, for example, we're going to be initiating a little more working from home. So that'll be nice. So the office environment is going to be very minimal in terms of who is in there. It'll probably be 2 or 3 people as opposed to the 15, I think, that are in there now. And then around the resort, it's just going to be the masks and the gloves were deemed necessary. But a lot of, as I said, we're going to have pretty minimal staff in the beginning. So we'll work through that as we go.
Okay. So one thing that came up that I thought was interesting is this top one, because we talked about this the other day about extra time needed to clean the event spaces, the ballrooms, venue managers. So you guys with venues, the time it's going to take, you're trying to now stagger vendors coming in so we're not on top of each other. How have you talked about that? Have you set processes in place? Are you still would you do a lunch and a dinner and turn the ballroom, that kind of thing?
Most of our event spaces are outside, so we have that advantage of having an open air setting. We have the barrel room at the winery, but it's really used for really small groups anyway. And so all of our big event spaces are outside in the open. So, and we also have multiple areas to load into. So we could feasibly have a couple of vendors there simultaneously setting up in different zones. So yes, I think we could potentially turn over. However, we don't really do multiple events in a day anyway. So we're really limiting to one wedding in a day anyway. So I don't foresee that being a big issue.
Kirsten?
Again, with the function space, we are, in looking at everything for the next few months, we don't have any situations where we've got a lunch followed by a dinner and a back-to-back scenario. So we will work to move locations so that we've got one event per event space.
Yeah. I think that's going to be the conversation with the added costs. It goes really back to, I think what Gabby was saying is these costs, now you're needing 36 hours for an event from installation to breakdown instead of just the 24-hour mark. Something like that is more than likely the scenario.
Yeah, and I think, we sort of lightly expect and require a wedding planner to be on site during some of the more complicated load-in. It's not uncommon for wedding planners to show up maybe a few hours beforehand, of course, trusting that the other vendors are doing a good job, which they are usually. But I could foresee possibly requirements of having a representative or a wedding planner on site from the very first moment, the very first vendor sets foot on property, just to ensure that those other vendors that are coming on are following all the appropriate protocol. And same for teardown too.
Yeah.
That's where we're moving to, is the planner is on site. It's already pretty much like that anyway, but that not just the venue's there, but the planner is there helping to oversee that setup and keep protocol in place.
Mm-hmm.
That's like managing a whole nother COVID client on top of their existing client.
Yeah.
I personally envision it being a whole separate person who is only paying attention to COVID rules as opposed to trying to, have dual responsibilities on that day. So, I think everybody would love to be able to pass that off and make sure that, the overall event for everyone's safety, because you can really guarantee your own company's safety of what you've implemented, but to have confidence that all your other vendors that you're surrounded with that day, I think it's going to be essential that we have one go-to person that really can monitor that for us.
Yeah, and I think it'll be really important for vendors to distinguish themselves in that way, being very open with what they're doing and how their teams are buying into it. And then obviously walking the walk and making sure that not only their teams, but everything else is going according to plan. Obviously there's going to be some bumps in the road in the beginning while we all figure this out, but just minimizing those, I think, is going to be a big differentiating factor. I could see some venues, and I'm not really speaking on behalf of Hilton at the moment, but I could see some venues moving towards, tighter vendor list and not allowing as many unvetted vendors onto their property.
Yeah. I mean, Gabby, going back to your conversation, you know, the thought in my head is just like having security, right? When I'm at a property that doesn't, especially someone's home or an estate, I get security and offsites. I don't want to be that security person, right?
Yeah.
Thankfully, when I work properties like Four Seasons, there's security on site. I have someone to call. There's a guy there that can help me. So it is this, and that way they can keep people safe. We're also keeping people safe in a different way. So 1,000%. As a planner, I don't foresee me diligently being able to do that. My nightmare last night was about bustling a bride's dress with gloves on. I mean, you know what I mean? Like that's yeah, right?
No, we each have our hands full with what our responsibilities are already. So to take on an additional something as significant as this, I think is really going to have to be a separate entity.
Yeah, agreed.
I think it's going to be interesting is that oversight person, I think getting vendor teams and professionals that are on site on the property on board, and also kind of like, hey, can you make sure that this is happening or that's happening? I see that being a rather short conversation and pretty straightforward because we're professionals and we do our job well as vendors and as venues. But where it gets gray and a little bit nerve-wracking for me is how much are we going to need to enforce certain protocols with guests, and who is that person who, you know, and what happens when that guest says they've had a couple drinks, you know. That's the part where it gets gray. I'm actually not at all worried about the collaboration between venue and vendor and planner. I think everybody's going to want to create a safe event. Everybody's going to want to streamline this and not create a bunch of extra work, but just let's figure out what we need to do and get it done. The other half of that is the part that I'm trying to formulate, which is the wild card that is the guests.
Yeah, I mean, I completely foresee those issues happening too. And I think that, again, in addition to maybe having the COVID-19 security representative, I think, like Zoe said, possibly having a mandated security for weddings that we previously would have never asked for, that might have to happen, you know, especially for the next few years. Because I think keeping your team members safe and also keeping the guests safe from each other in a sense, I definitely foresee that being a pretty significant issue. I think we've all seen some pretty ugly situations happen.
Are you talking about the drunkle?
Yes. And the groomsmen and the bridesmaid who didn't eat all week.
Yeah, I know. That's kind of the loosey-goosey when you start drinking and partying, right?
I mean, hopefully with smaller guest counts, that won't be as much of a problem. You know, I think in a smaller family, everybody knows each other's situation. It's a little hard to act like that. But eventually, as the events get a little bigger, or if you get the wrong client in there, I think security might be something that's going to be required for all events. Yeah. Even as a venue, and again, I'm not speaking in terms of Hilton, but if a venue is going to be held responsible, then they very well may say, yep, you got to have security the whole time.
I will tell you that we've actually spoke about that, because I can even tell just in the conversations that I have with clients who's going to be who will have the guests that will say, I'm not wearing a mask, or I'm not going to, participate in that, or this is crazy. Like, why are you over exaggerating this whole situation?
Yeah.
Understanding, all the repercussions that could be had if somebody were to be ill. We've had discussions and nothing's solidified yet, but we have talked about kind of reinforcing events with security, just to act as a person that's kind of managing the whole COVID situation. So, yeah, I mean, again, fortunately for us, we have a security team, and I think they're going to be deployed in many different ways as it relates to this.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and I think it'll be good for everyone, the people who are on site for a wedding the whole time, or any event for that matter, kind of works through some of the scenarios and how they're going to handle it. Because, I mean, it's really easy to ask someone to leave who's had too much to drink, but it doesn't work the same if the bride is running a temperature, or the father of the bride is running a temperature, or the father of the bride or the bride is the one who's coughing and sneezing. I mean, those are all kinds of scenarios we're going to have to figure out how to handle in advance.
We're getting almost to the top of the hour. I wanted to put out there if anyone has any questions from the point that we've made so far. One thing that I thought was interesting is, providing amenity bags containing face covers, hand sanitizer, COVID awareness card. Is that something you guys are implementing, thinking about doing as venues or?
Not for the guests. We're going to have signage. We will likely have the markers, something nice and discreet on the ground for outside the bathrooms.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think at this point, that's another TBD, whether or not we're going to push people using those, having them available. We're going to have sanitizing stations, hand washing stations, all of that in place. But whether or not we're providing that for the guests, not unless we're required. I doubt we will. We will have it for our own staff, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
That would be really up to what's required, what's mandated.
So mandated, sorry, just to make sure, mandated is just for the staff. Right now it's not required for guests?
We don't know. We're still waiting for those guidelines to come into play.
Yeah, nobody has really, no governmental agency has written any guidelines specific for gatherings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it could vary by county as well. So that's something to watch out for.
Great.
What I'm doing is actually setting expectations early with the clients that there will likely be guidelines and mandates that we're going to have to follow.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what those are yet, but just as a heads up, we're going to have them.
Mm-hmm.
And try and set that expectation early so that when that conversation does happen, there's not a big shock that they can only have 50 or 75 people, and there's not a big shock if guests are required to wear masks or if guests are required to have their temperature taken, but that the expectation that we're going to have a conversation around some of that is already in place.
Mm-hmm. We're doing the same thing here.
Yeah, that's great advice.
I'm doing the same thing.
I can't see where the questions are for some reason on my thing. Do you guys see them?
They're at the very bottom on mine. It says chat.
I guess I'm going to stop sharing the document and then we can go from there. Chat, here we go. Wow. Okay. So let's see. The temp thing, will that be at venues as well? So Dina was asking, these are kind of old actually. Maybe we address some of these. Who's taking temperatures? Is temp tent thing, will it be at venues as well? That's not really clear right now. Susie talked about weekly contract. Is that right, Susie? Really helps create a regular reminder. So I think that's what Gabby was referring to, having teams having to sign everything. Mm-hmm. And okay, so I don't think there's any other questions. Any other words of wisdom you guys want to share before we jump off? Ladies?
I would just say that this call has, I think, given us all maybe more of a pathway and a roadway to make smaller events happen this year, at least some of the events that are still on the books, just to kind of get us through till next year. And some of this stuff might become normal for next year as well. So I think fine-tuning and sharpening that toolkit is going to be really key to keep the industry going for another 2 years.
Yeah. I think that probably just the thing I would take away from this most is that I feel like for vendors who have larger groups, really it starts with ensuring that all of your team members are healthy and that they all have the proper PPE to wear so that we can function and do our jobs. And I think that if you can start with those two things, then you're really on the right path.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think for what I keep coming back to is we're all in this together. We keep hearing that, but we are all learning as well together. So I think that what I really want to go into opening the season with is that we're keeping really open lines of communication. we're all learning something different at different times, whether it's client driven or it's government driven, about what's going to be required and how we might want to go forward and do things in the new normal. I think just keeping it really not rigid, but conversational, kind, collaborative, all those lovely words that make us event professionals, that make us problem solvers, and really tapping into that in a new way. That's my hope.
Yeah. Anyone else? Kirsten, Paige? I don't know where Gabby went. I can't see her anymore.
I just know that this is an incredibly creative group. I love our local vendors. And so I definitely have faith that when we start to tackle the solutions, I don't think it's going to be a problem to come up with those solutions, because this is, I think the Santa Barbara area and the Central Coast is home to some of the brightest event minds and creative minds in the country.
Yeah.
So you have a whole bunch of questions that are rolling in.
Yeah, I saw that, and I just wanted to make sure, and I'll address these questions. Today, I really wanted to go through facts for those of you that jumped on a little bit later. So I really wanted to go through facts and preparing you for what do you need? When are we going to open? When is it going to be 50 guests? I don't know.
Can I respond to that one really quickly? Mm-hmm. So, and thanks for asking the question. Lindsay from Magnolia and I had an interesting conversation yesterday afternoon about this notion of like, when will there be larger guest counts? When can we go to 200? And while there isn't anything detailed in the Santa Barbara Rise Guide about large numbers, there is some language about events or gatherings, is what they call them, gatherings of up to 50 people. But it's all based on the data and percentages and things like that. I mean, you can look at the Rise Guide and you can look at the table. I won't read it to you guys, but one of the challenges we face is that as we go through these different phases, and so gatherings of up to 50 are in phase 3 of the Santa Barbara Reopening Guide, but because it's all based on scientific data, if that data changes, they're going to reset us back into an earlier phase. So, for example, you might have a September client who's got 50 guests, and we might hit phase 3 in August, but by the end of August, we could have something that changes the data that resets us back to phase 2. So there is a little bit of a gamble here, I think, in trying to plan, ahead, particularly in the next 3 months.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that Kirsten mentioned earlier was that it's an investment to be prepared for the guidelines that are going to be announced. And it's a little, obviously, everyone's being very cautious of how they're spending their money. So it's a fine line between making a financial commitment to put in physical barriers, the plexiglass, those kinds of commitments that we may or may not find to be mandated. So I definitely love the fact that we're sticking with facts today, because the unfortunate thing is there is so many variables, and as Nicole mentioned, there's going to be waves, and we really cannot right now predict what those some of these markers are going to be. 50, 100, 200 gatherings. We just have no idea right now.
Well, and it will be impossible to predict the ebb and flow of the waves of the disease.
Mm-hmm. Certainly.
I'm looking at a couple other questions. Any expectations, Susie, any expectations from planners specific to catering that we can plan for? Planners?
I didn't understand the question.
Yeah, I didn't understand the question.
What are the expectations from planners specific to catering that catering can prepare for? For me as a planner, right now I don't have an expectation. I mean
an expectation of the catering company?
That's what I'm reading, right, Susie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to fall in line with the guidelines and requirements for restaurants and food service, and then it's probably going to go up another notch or two.
So does that mean like wearing gloves and to set out all forks and plates? It's funny because I see a commercial right now like announcing that other places are opening, maybe opening on our news, and
I'll be right up. I have to do it.
And it's showing people without gloves setting a table outside. And I'm thinking, well, is that a rule? Will that be a rule?
I saw that too.
Mm-hmm.
It was a news story.
Yeah.
And I mean, you have to remember too, I mean, there are people who maybe are not doing it right. So we shouldn't always, or doing it to our own standards or the standards that your company or the people you want to work with, you know, we should be thinking in the highest standard possible.
Mhm.
Well, and like you said earlier, Paige, it will vary from county to county.
Yeah.
Lindsay, that news story was from a different state.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I realized that, but I was seeing that and thinking, wow, okay, well, like, I mean, I guess other places are more lax and
They are.
The bars are open in a lot of, I mean, I have my boss's daughter, she goes to Alabama State, and they're all hanging out in the bars, having drinks at nighttime.
My folks in Dallas, they're not hanging out at the bars, but Dallas is. So, yeah, I know. So we can only really look at what we're doing here, this county today, with the facts that we have. I think the real big takeaway is getting these ducks in a row of the 5 criteria and looking into each of them. If that is the takeaway from today, what do you guys think? You know,
I think that's a great place to start.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Philippe asked if there was going to be like a hub of information where everybody would be sharing their documents and things like that. And like Gabby said earlier, we collaborated very early on how to codify your safe return to work. We are developing, the documents that we're developing right now are intercompany only, but we will be developing a one sheet that we can provide to vendors and share with the community that details some of what we're doing that might be able to help other people implement best practices.
Yeah, I second that. We'll have a short list of things that we can send to clients and what expectations are, or what our guidelines are based on what we're being told we need to do, and also what standards we're setting for ourselves. But we'll definitely have something we're sharing with people.
Yeah. And Gabby, again, with you, starting with CDC, the documents, let's talk about the facts. So if someone is wanting to put a document together, various places you can look at: CDC, California Department of Health. Any other thoughts on any of you that are on here?
The Santa Barbara County Public Health
Thank you. Yeah.
website.
Yeah, you need to look at your local.
Yeah,
as
or Ventura
well.
County.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And start developing your internal training packet for this.
Yeah, and they have guidelines, and then you just kind of implement, you revise it according to your practices and what fits best for your workspace and what makes the most sense. So, yeah.
I see Toby asked a question that I think is I've heard a lot, so I just kind of wanted to touch on that really quickly, which is what's going to happen to dancing. I think that the idea of dancing and even like this notion of the cocktail hour, I think that as the local governments and the state governments continue to issue new rules and regulations about reopening, we'll begin to see how that will affect those elements. So for example, as we move into phase 3 and they allow gatherings up to 50 guests, in the Santa Barbara RISE guidelines, it still does say that we need to be practicing physical distancing, which would eliminate or prevent you from having a dance floor, really, because I don't know how, we've been brainstorming on this, trust me. I don't know how you create a dance floor with physical distancing pods. So I think until that element goes away, the notion, and it does as you get to phase 4, the physical distancing requirements starts to disappear. That's when I think you'll be able to see elements like dance floors and lounges and things like that come back into designs. But it'll really be mandated by the state and by your local county.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, thank you guys very, very much. We'll do this again as information comes out, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for putting it together.
Thank you.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thanks, Zoe.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.